not propping up Detroit. I also think I understand unions. I worked for one. My wife works for a union now. My daughter works for a union. Many of Ken's friends whose parents worked in the auto industry, those kids did not want to go to the auto industry. They did not want to work, nor did their parents want them working like they did so hard. They wanted to go to college and get out of Detroit. Second is the union's complete failures to educate their membership and develop leadership has been a major problem. I mean, for Detroit, period, but for the country. I mean, it's been a serious, serious problem. And although the workers embraced the union did not, and they did not educate their sons and daughters about the union. The unions didn't develop leadership, and they didn't educate the membership, and consequently, it's been a major problem where we're at today. And if you look at I've looked, as I said, my wife this day works for a union, my daughter does. There's no young leadership that I know of in the entire country that you could say, that's hope for the unions.
Well, you're right. It's been described as a major problem. We're going to have just a few minutes, I'm afraid, to have the panel summarize their findings and their comments. We'll start with Reverend Washington.
Well, just to say, I'm very excited to think about what is coming in the future. I certainly want to hear from our panelists this afternoon as to their perspectives with so many fond memories and the shaping of who I am coming from the Detroit area. I am really interested in knowing what's coming, and especially I hope I hear a little bit about what's going on in the religious life of the city, because so many of the churches we know and love from the past certainly have dried up as the neighborhoods have dried up. And that's not just a Detroit problem either, but I am interested in knowing what is the church life going forward.
I too am looking forward to this afternoon and to get a sense about where Detroit is headed. Being a writer and also involved in the arts community, I'm really concerned about what's happening with the Detroit Institute of Arts and what's happening with the African American Museum there and what's happening in that whole area. And also, I feel very, very optimistic, having heard everyone speak this morning. I'm looking forward again to this afternoon. And I kind of have a kind of renewed allegiance to Detroit, not that it ever left, but I like the optimism, and I'm loving the analysis of what's happening there. And I want to thank everyone for sharing and listening, and also the great panelists, but I'm looking forward to this afternoon.
I think that thank you. I want to highlight the ways in which the value of education has, I think, been a theme among all of us, and I'm aware of the reports of the travesty going on in Detroit public schools at this point, in terms of the way, and it's however because it's really structured by the state at this point, but I'd say that I'd had a conversation recently with a 21-year-old daughter that grew up in Detroit of a friend of mine, and she had asked me to look out for her because she was interested in some internships here. She's a senior at Bard, just in case anybody knows any internships right now. But so we started this conversation a couple of months ago, and so she got very interested in my story about Detroit as I was interested in her story about Detroit. And so that there was a good base for this conversation. So I asked her to read my comments before I came here today. And the conversation was by text at about 1 o'clock in the morning. But eventually she said, I'm sad. It's terrible to think about the type of education you had, and when I look at what's going on among my friends in Detroit now. And then I was feeling guilty, like, oh my God, I set this child up. But so we had a back and forth about what she does with those feelings at this point. But I do want to sort of link back to my deep concern about the role of education and the ways in which charter school movement at this point has, that I think is driven by corporate interests, is driving the engine in Michigan. And obviously now for the federal government. So I do think that that's a really important part of the conversation that we leave with. And I'm very grateful to have been part of this.
Well, I am grateful times 100. I'm just thrilled to be here with all of you and hope to be here all day to interact. Let me just close, I hope, on a high note. Remember I told you when I got to Boston in 1971, I was coming from Detroit, and I was just staggered by how poor the city was. It was practically in default. The racial climate was horrendous. Industry was leaving. The population had fallen from 800,000 to 560,000 between 1950 and 1980. That's Boston. And yet Boston comes back. And it comes back big time, as we know. Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, and so forth. It has a real renaissance. I actually wrote a book called The Boston Renaissance, Race, Space, and Economic Change in American Metropolis. Detroit can come back, too. Detroit is the Renaissance city. It has Renaissance Center already. So the fact is that while Detroit has been through some very dark days, and I don't think we can dispute that, I am thrilled to see some of the glimmerings of a renaissance. And I just hope that that's going to go on, and I hope more and more people will spread the word about what a great place Detroit was and what a great place Detroit is going to be again.
Amen. That's why we're here.
Barry, thank you. Our panelists, Dr. Barry Bluestone, we had Dr. Paula Elliott, Dr. Lloyd Sheldon Johnson, Reverend Ellis Washington, thank you very much. And some key announcements. Stick around. Lunch is going to be served in the room back here. Our keynote speaker, Camilo Jose Vergara, who is a MacArthur Fellow, has written and photographed Detroit in ways that have become famous. Gentleman right here. And we also want you to stick around for this afternoon's panel. We talked about Detroit of the past in its present. Now we talk about the present and its future, 2000 to 2050. Thank you very much.
Phillip, thank you for chairing. That was beautiful.
I wanted